Preface. The concept of intellectuals is a rather curious one. Who qualifies? The question arises in an instructive way in Dwight MacDonald's classic 1945 essay The Responsibility of Intellectuals. The essay is a bitter and sardonic critique of distinguished thinkers pontificating about the collective guilt of German refugees who were barely surviving in the ruins of wartime disaster. He contrasts their self-righteous contempt for the miserable survivors with the reaction of soldiers of the victorious army, who recognize the humanity of the victims and sympathize with their plight. The former are intellectuals, the latter not. MacDonald ends his essay with simple words, "It is a great thing to be able to see what is right under your nose." What of the responsibility of intellectuals? Those who qualify for the title have a degree of privilege conferred by the status, yielding opportunity beyond the norm. Opportunity confers responsibility which, in turn, poses choices, sometimes hard ones. One choice is to follow the path of integrity, wherever it may lead. Another is to put such concerns aside, passively adopting the conventions instituted by structures of authority. The task in the latter case, then, is to carry out faithfully the instructions of those who hold the reins of power, to be loyal and faithful servants, not after reflective judgment but by reflexive conformism. That is a fine way to evade the moral and intellectual difficulties of challenge and to escape what can be painful consequences of seeking to bend the moral arc of the universe towards justice. The alternatives are familiar. Thus we distinguish the commissars and apparatchiks from the dissidents who confront the challenge and face the consequences which vary, depending on the nature of the society. Many dissidents are well known and rightly honored, and their harsh treatment is rightly denounced with fervor and outrage, Václav Havel, Aiy, Shirin Ebadi, and a distinguished list of others. We also rightly condemn the apologists for the evil society, who offer at most tepid criticism of mistakes of rulers who they routinely describe as benign in intent. Others are missing from the list of honored dissidents, for example, the 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests, who were brutally murdered by Salvadoran forces fresh from renewed training by U.S. forces, acting on the specific orders of the U.S. client government. In fact, they are scarcely known at all. Few even know their names, or recall the events. The official orders to murder them have yet to appear in the United States anywhere near the mainstream, not because they are secret, they were published prominently in the mainstream Spanish press. This is not an exception. It is the rule. The facts are not in the least obscure. They are well known to activists who protested the horrendous U.S. crimes in Central America, and to scholarship. In the Cambridge History of the Cold War, John Coatsworth writes that from 1960 to the Soviet collapse in 1990, the numbers of political prisoners, torture victims, and executions of nonviolent political dissenters in Latin America vastly exceeded those in the Soviet Union and its East European satellites. When we turn to coverage in media and intellectual journals, we find that the picture is reversed. To take one of many striking illustrations, Edward Herman and I compared the New York Times coverage of the murder of a Polish priest whose assassins were quickly found and punished with the murder of 100 religious martyrs in El Salvador, including Archbishop Oscar Romero and 4 American church women, whose assassins were long concealed, while the crimes were denied by U.S. officials and the victims subjected to official contempt. The coverage of the murdered priest in an enemy state vastly exceeded that of 100 religious martyrs in the U.S. client state, and was radically different in style in the way predicted by a propaganda model of the media. 1 This is only one illustration of a highly consistent pattern over many years. One choice is to follow the path of integrity, wherever it may lead. To be sure, there might be some explanation other than service to power. Occasionally, very rarely, the facts receive some notice, accompanied by an effort to explain them away. In the case of the religious martyrs, an alternative explanation was offered in a derisive response by the distinguished U.S. journalist Nicholas Lemon, national correspondent of the liberal Atlantic Monthly. The discrepancy can be explained by saying the press tends to focus on only a few things at a time, Lemon writes, and the U.S. press was most focused on Poland. Lemon's explanation is easily tested by a look at the New York Times Index, which shows that in the relevant period coverage of the two countries was virtually identical, a little higher for El Salvador. But in an intellectual environment of alternative facts, details like this hardly matter. Point 2. In practice, the honorific term dissident is reserved in practice for dissidents in enemy states. The 6 murdered Latin American intellectuals, the Archbishop, and the many others like them in U.S. client states who protest state crimes and are therefore murdered, tortured, or imprisoned are not termed dissidents, if they are mentioned at all. Terminology at home differs as well. There were, for example, intellectuals who protested the Vietnam War, for varying reasons. To take prominent examples who illustrate the bounds of the elite spectrum, journalist Joseph Alsop protested that the U.S. intervention was too limited, while Arthur Schlesinger retorted that escalation probably wouldn't succeed and would prove to be too costly for ourselves. Nevertheless, he added, we all pray that Alsop will be right in thinking that U.S. force may prevail, and if it does, we may all be saluting the wisdom and statesmanship of the American government in winning victory while leaving the tragic country gutted and devastated by bombs, burned by napalm, turned into a wasteland by chemical defoliation, a land of ruin and wreck, with its political and institutional fabric pulverized. Alsop and Schlesinger are not termed dissidents. Rather, they are, respectively, a hawk and a dove, at the opposite ends of the spectrum of legitimate criticism of the U.S. war. There are, to be sure, some who are off the spectrum entirely, but they are not dissidents either. As Kennedy Johnson National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy explained in the establishment journal Foreign Affairs, they are wild men in the wings, who raise objections of principle to U.S. aggression, not merely tactical questions about feasibility and cost. Bundy was writing in 1967, at the time when the bitterly anti-communist military historian and Vietnam specialist Bernard Fall, highly respected in the U.S. government and mainstream opinion, feared that Vietnam as a cultural and historic entity is threatened with extinction. As the countryside literally dies under the blows of the largest military machine ever unleashed on an area of this size. But it was only wild men in the wings who questioned the justice of the American cause. As the war ended in 1975, intellectuals across the mainstream spectrum provided their interpretations of what had happened. They ranged across the Alsop-Schlesinger spectrum. At the extreme dovish end, Anthony Lewis wrote that the intervention began with blundering efforts to do good, blundering because it failed, efforts to do good by doctrinal principle, evidence unnecessary, but by 1969 it was clear that the intervention was a mistake because the United States could not impose a solution except at a price too costly to itself. At the same time, polls showed that about 70% of the population regarded the war as not a mistake but fundamentally wrong and immoral. Like the soldiers of 1945 who could appreciate the plight of miserable German refugees, they are not intellectuals. The examples are typical. Opposition to the war peaked in 1970, after the Nixon-Kissinger invasion of Cambodia. Right at that time, political scientist Charles Kadushin conducted an extensive study of attitudes of elite intellectuals. On Vietnam, he found that overwhelmingly, they adopted a pragmatic stance, criticizing the war as a mistake that proved too costly. Wild men in the wings were barely at the level of statistical error. Point 3. Washington's wars in Indochina were the worst crime of the post-World War II era. The worst crime of this millennium is the U.S.U.K. invasion of Iraq, with horrifying consequences throughout the region and no end in sight. The intellectual elite rose to the occasion in the familiar way. Barack Obama was highly praised by liberal intellectuals for adopting the stance of the doves. In Obama's own words, over the past decade, American troops have made extraordinary sacrifices to give Iraqis an opportunity to claim their own future, but the hard truth is we have not seen the end of American sacrifice in Iraq. The war was a grave mistake, a strategic blunder, far too costly to us for a judgment that may be compared to that of many Russian generals about the Soviet decision to intervene in Afghanistan. The pattern generalizes. There should hardly be any need to review examples, as has been done extensively in print, with no detectable effect on elite intellectual doctrine. There are no dissidents within our shores, nor commissars and apparatchiks. Only wild men in the wings and responsible intellectuals, who qualify as true experts. The responsibility of the experts is spelled out by one of the most foremost and distinguished of them. One qualifies as an expert, Henry Kissinger explains, by elaborating and defining the consensus of one's constituency at a high level, the constituency being those who establish the framework within which experts execute the assigned tasks. The categories are quite conventional, going back to the earliest usage of the concept intellectual in the contemporary sense during the Dreyfus affair in France. The leading figure of the Dreyfusards, Émile Zola, was sentenced to a year in prison for the infamy of calling for justice for the falsely accused Alfred Dreyfus, and fled to England to escape further punishment. He was bitterly denounced by the immortals of the French Academy. The Dreyfusards were true wild men in the wings. They were guilty of one of the most ridiculous eccentricities of our time, in the words of academician Ferdinand Brunetière, the pretension of raising writers, scientists, professors, and philologists to the rank of supermen, who dare to treat our generals as idiots, our social institutions as absurd, and our traditions as unhealthy. They dared to interfere with matters properly left to experts, to responsible men, technocratic and policy-oriented intellectuals, in the contemporary terminology of liberal discourse. So what then is the responsibility of intellectuals? They always have a choice. In enemy states, they can choose to be commissars or dissidents. In U.S. client states, in the modern period, the choice can be bitter beyond words. At home, they can choose to be responsible experts or wild men in the wings. And then there is always the choice of following MacDonald's good advice. It is a great thing to be able to see what is right under your nose and to have the simple honesty to tell it as it is. Part I. The responsibility of intellectuals. 20 years ago, Dwight MacDonald published a series of articles in Politics on the responsibility of peoples and, specifically, the responsibility of intellectuals. I read them as an undergraduate, in the years just after the war, and had occasion to read them again a few months ago. They seem to me to have lost none of their power or persuasiveness. MacDonald is concerned with the question of war guilt. He asks the question, to what extent were the German or Japanese people responsible for the atrocities committed by their governments? And, quite properly, he turns the question back to us, to what extent are the British or American people responsible for the vicious terror bombings of civilians, perfected as a technique of warfare by the Western democracies and reaching their culmination in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, surely among the most unspeakable crimes in history. To an undergraduate in 1945-46, to anyone whose political and moral consciousness had been formed by the horrors of the 1930s, by the war in Ethiopia, the Russian Purge, the China Incident, the Spanish Civil War, the Nazi atrocities, the Western reaction to these events and, in part, complicity in them, these questions had particular significance and poignancy. With respect to the responsibility of intellectuals, there are still other, equally disturbing questions. Intellectuals are in a position to expose the lies of governments, to analyze actions according to their causes and motives and often hidden intentions. In the Western world, at least, they have the power that comes from political liberty, from access to information and freedom of expression. For a privileged minority, Western democracy provides the leisure, the facilities, and the training to seek the truth lying hidden behind the veil of distortion and misrepresentation, ideology and class interest, through which the events of current history are presented to us. The responsibilities of intellectuals, then, are much deeper than what MacDonald calls the responsibility of people, given the unique privileges that intellectuals enjoy. The issues that MacDonald raised are as pertinent today as they were 20 years ago. We can hardly avoid asking ourselves to what extent the American people bear responsibility for the savage American assault on a largely helpless rural population in Vietnam, still another atrocity in what Asians see as the Vasco da Gama era of world history. As for those of us who stood by in silence and apathy as this catastrophe slowly took shape over the past dozen years, on what page of history do we find our proper place? Only the most insensible can escape these questions. I want to return to them, later on, after a few scattered remarks about the responsibility of intellectuals and how, in practice, they go about meeting this responsibility in the mid-1960s. It is the responsibility of intellectuals to speak the truth and to expose lies. This, at least, may seem enough of a truism to pass over without comment. Not so, however. For the modern intellectual, it is not at all obvious. Thus we have Martin Heidegger writing, in a pro-Hitler declaration of 1933, that truth is the revelation of that which makes a people certain, clear, and strong in its action and knowledge. It is only this kind of truth that one has a responsibility to speak. Americans tend to be more forthright. When Arthur Schlesinger was asked by the New York Times in November 1965 to explain the contradiction between his published account of the Bay of Pigs incident and the story he had given the press at the time of the attack, he simply remarked that he had lied, and a few days later, he went on to compliment the Times for also having suppressed information on the planned invasion, in the national interest, as this term was defined by the group of arrogant and deluded men of whom Schlesinger gives such a flattering portrait in his recent account of the Kennedy administration. It is of no particular interest that one man is quite happy to lie in behalf of a cause which he knows to be unjust, but it is significant that such events provoke so little response in the intellectual community. For example, no one has said that there is something strange in the offer of a major chair in the humanities to a historian who feels it to be his duty to persuade the world that an American-sponsored invasion of a nearby country is nothing of the sort. And what of the incredible sequence of lies on the part of our government and its spokesman concerning such matters as negotiations in Vietnam? The facts are known to all who care to know. The press, foreign and domestic, has presented documentation to refute each falsehood as it appears. But the power of the government's propaganda apparatus is such that the citizen who does not undertake a research project on the subject can hardly hope to confront government pronouncements with fact. Point 1. Intellectuals are in a position to expose the lies of governments, to analyze actions according to their causes and motives and often hidden intentions. The deceit and distortion surrounding the American invasion of Vietnam is by now so familiar that it has lost its power to shock. It is therefore useful to recall that although new levels of cynicism are constantly being reached, their clear antecedents were accepted at home with quiet toleration. It is a useful exercise to compare government statements at the time of the invasion of Guatemala in 1954 with Eisenhower's admission to be more accurate, his boast a decade later that American planes were sent to help the invaders. New York Times, October 14, 1965. Nor is it only in moments of crisis that duplicity is considered perfectly in order. New frontiersmen, for example, have scarcely distinguished themselves by a passionate concern for historical accuracy, even when they are not being called upon to provide a propaganda cover for ongoing actions. For example, Arthur Schlesinger, New York Times, February 6, 1966, describes the bombing of North Vietnam and the massive escalation of military commitment in early 1965 as based on a perfectly rational argument. So long as the Viet Cong thought they were going to win the war, they obviously would not be interested in any kind of negotiated settlement. The date is important. Had this statement been made 6 months earlier, one could attribute it to ignorance. But this statement appeared after the UN, North Vietnamese, and Soviet initiatives had been front-page news for months. It was already public knowledge that these initiatives had preceded the escalation of February 1965 and, in fact, continued for several weeks after the bombing began. Correspondents in Washington tried desperately to find some explanation for the startling deception that had been revealed. Chalmers Roberts, for example, wrote in the Boston Globe on November 19 with unconscious irony. Late February 1965 hardly seemed to Washington to be a propitious moment for negotiations since Mr. Johnson had just ordered the first bombing of North Vietnam in an effort to bring Hanoi to a conference table where the bargaining chips on both sides would be more closely matched. Coming at that moment, Schlesinger's statement is less an example of deceit than of contempt for an audience that can be expected to tolerate such behavior with silence, if not approval. Point 2. To turn to someone closer to the actual formation and implementation of policy, consider some of the reflections of Walt Rostow, a man who, according to Schlesinger, brought a spacious historical view to the conduct of foreign affairs in the Kennedy administration. Point 3. According to his analysis, the guerrilla warfare in Indochina in 1946 was launched by Stalin IV and Hanoi initiated the guerrilla war against South Vietnam in 1958, view from the 7th floor, pages 39 and 152. Similarly, the communist planners probed the free world spectrum of defense in northern Azerbaijan and Greece, where Stalin supported substantial guerrilla warfare. Ibid, pages 36 and 148, operating from plans carefully laid in 1945. And in Central Europe, the Soviet Union was not prepared to accept a solution which would remove the dangerous tensions from Central Europe at the risk of even slowly staged corrosion of communism in East Germany. Ibid, p. 156. It is interesting to compare these observations with studies by scholars actually concerned with historical events. The remark about Stalin's initiating the First Vietnamese War in 1946 does not even merit refutation. As to Hanoi's purported initiative of 1958, the situation is more clouded. But even government sources 5 concede that in 1959 Hanoi received the first direct reports of what DM6 referred to as his own Algerian War, and that only after this did they lay their plans to involve themselves in this struggle. In fact, in December 1958, Hanoi made another of its many attempts, rebuffed once again by Saigon and the United States, to establish diplomatic and commercial relations with the Saigon government on the basis of the status quo. Point 7. Rostow offers no evidence of Stalin's support for the Greek guerrillas. In fact, though the historical record is far from clear, it seems that Stalin was by no means pleased with the adventurism of the Greek guerrillas, who, from his point of view, were upsetting the satisfactory post-war imperialist settlement. Point 8. Rostow's remarks about Germany are more interesting still. He does not see fit to mention, for example, the Russian notes of March, April 1952, which proposed unification of Germany under internationally supervised elections, with withdrawal of all troops within a year, if there was a guarantee that a reunified Germany would not be permitted to join a Western military alliance. Point 9. And he has also momentarily forgotten his own characterization of the strategy of the Truman and Eisenhower administrations, to avoid any serious negotiation with the Soviet Union until the West could confront Moscow with German rearmament within an organized European framework, as a fait accompli tend to be sure, in defiance of the Potsdam agreements. In addition to this growing lack of concern for truth, we find a real or feigned naivete about American actions that reaches startling proportions. But most interesting of all is Rostow's reference to Iran. The facts are that there was a Russian attempt to impose by force a pro-Soviet government in northern Azerbaijan that would grant the Soviet Union access to Iranian oil. This was rebuffed by superior Anglo-American force in 1946, at which point the more powerful imperialism obtained full rights to Iranian oil for itself, with the installation of a pro-Western government. We recall what happened when, for a brief period in the early 1950s, the only Iranian government with something of a popular base experimented with the curious idea that Iranian oil should belong to the Iranians. What is interesting, however, is the description of northern Azerbaijan as part of the free world spectrum of defense. It is pointless, by now, to comment on the debasement of the phrase free world. But by what law of nature does Iran, with its resources, fall within Western dominion? The bland assumption that it does is most revealing of deep-seated attitudes towards the conduct of foreign affairs. In addition to this growing lack of concern for truth, we find, in recent published statements, a real or feigned naivete about American actions that reaches startling proportions. For example, Arthur Schlesinger, according to The Times, February 6, 1966, characterized our Vietnamese policies of 1954 as part of our general program of international goodwill. Unless intended as irony, this remark shows either a colossal cynicism or the inability, on a scale that defies measurement, to comprehend elementary phenomena of contemporary history. Similarly, what is one to make of the testimony of Thomas Schelling before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, January 27, 1965, in which he discusses two great dangers if all Asia goes communist? 11. First, this would exclude the United States and what we call Western civilization from a large part of the world that is poor and colored and potentially hostile. Second, a country like the United States probably cannot maintain self-confidence if just about the greatest thing it ever attempted, namely to create the basis for decency and prosperity and democratic government in the underdeveloped world, had to be acknowledged as a failure or as an attempt that we wouldn't try again. It surpasses belief that a person with even a minimal acquaintance with the record of American foreign policy could produce such statements. It surpasses belief, that is, unless we look at the matter from a more historical point of view and place such statements in the context of the hypocritical moralism of the past, for example, of Woodrow Wilson, who was going to teach the Latin Americans the art of good government, and who wrote, 1902, that it is our peculiar duty to teach colonial peoples order and self-control and the drill and habit of law and obedience. Or of the missionaries of the 1840s, who described the hideous and degrading opium wars as the result of a great design of Providence to make the wickedness of men subserve his purposes of mercy toward China, in breaking through her wall of exclusion, and bringing the empire into more immediate contact with Western and Christian nations. Or, to approach the present, of A.A. Burleigh, who, in commenting on the Dominican intervention, has the impertinence to attribute the problems of the Caribbean countries to imperialism, Russian imperialism. 12. As a final example of this failure of skepticism, consider the remarks of Henry Kissinger in his concluding remarks at the Harvard-Oxford television debate on America's Vietnam policies. He observed, rather sadly, that what disturbs him most is that others question not our judgment, but our motives. A remarkable comment by a man whose professional concern is political analysis, that is, analysis of the actions of governments in terms of motives that are unexpressed in official propaganda and perhaps only dimly perceived by those whose acts they govern. No one would be disturbed by an analysis of the political behavior of the Russians, French, or Tanzanians questioning their motives and interpreting their actions by the long-range interests concealed behind their official rhetoric. But it is an article of faith that American motives are pure and not subject to analysis, see Note 1. Although it is nothing new in American intellectual history or, for that matter, in the general history of imperialist apologia, this innocence becomes increasingly distasteful as the power it serves grows more dominant in world affairs, and more capable, therefore, of the unconstrained viciousness that the mass media present to us each day. We are hardly the first power in history to combine material interests, great technological capacity, and an utter disregard for the suffering and misery of the lower orders. The long tradition of naivete and self-righteousness that disfigures our intellectual history, however, must serve as a warning to the Third World, if such a warning is needed, as to how our protestations of sincerity and benign intent are to be interpreted. It is an article of faith that American motives are pure and not subject to analysis. The basic assumptions of the new frontiersmen should be pondered carefully by those who look forward to the involvement of academic intellectuals in politics. For example, I have referred above to Arthur Schlesinger's objections to the Bay of Pigs invasion, but the reference was imprecise. True, he felt that it was a terrible idea, but not because the notion of sponsoring an exile attempt to overthrow Castro seemed intolerable in itself. Such a reaction would be the merest sentimentality, unthinkable to a tough-minded realist. The difficulty, rather, was that it seemed unlikely that the deception could succeed. The operation, in his view, was ill-conceived but not otherwise objectionable. 13. In a similar vein, Schlesinger quotes with approval Kennedy's realistic assessment of the situation resulting from Trujillo's assassination. There are three possibilities in descending order of preference: a decent democratic regime, a continuation of the Trujillo regime or a Castro regime. We ought to aim at the first, but we really can't renounce the second until we are sure that we can avoid the third. P. 769. The reason why the third possibility is so intolerable is explained a few pages later. P. 774. Communist success in Latin America would deal a much harder blow to the power and influence of the United States. Of course, we can never really be sure of avoiding the third possibility, therefore, in practice, we will always settle for the second, as we are now doing in Brazil and Argentina, for example. Point 14. Or consider Walt Rostow's views on American policy in Asia. Point 15. The basis on which we must build this policy is that we are openly threatened and we feel menaced by Communist China. To prove that we are menaced is of course unnecessary, and the matter receives no attention. It is enough that we feel menaced. Our policy must be based on our national heritage and our national interests. Our national heritage is briefly outlined in the following terms. Throughout the 19th century, in good conscience Americans could devote themselves to the extension of both their principles and their power on this continent, making use of the somewhat elastic concept of the Monroe Doctrine and, of course, extending the American interest to Alaska and the mid-Pacific Islands. Both our insistence on unconditional surrender and the idea of post-war occupation represented the formulation of American security interests in Europe and Asia. So much for our heritage. As to our interests, the matter is equally simple. Fundamental is our profound interest that societies abroad develop and strengthen those elements in their respective cultures that elevate and protect the dignity of the individual against the state. At the same time, we must counter the ideological threat, namely the possibility that the Chinese communists can prove to Asians by progress in China that communist methods are better and faster than democratic methods. Nothing is said about those people in Asian cultures to whom our conception of the proper relation of the individual to the state may not be the uniquely important value, people who might, for example, be concerned with preserving the dignity of the individual against concentrations of foreign or domestic capital, or against semi-feudal structures, such as Trujillo-type dictatorships, introduced or kept in power by American arms. All of this is flavored with allusions to our religious and ethical value systems and to our diffuse and complex concepts which are to the Asian mind so much more difficult to grasp than Marxist dogma, and are so disturbing to some Asians because of their very lack of dogmatism. To prove that we are menaced is of course unnecessary, and the matter receives no attention. It is enough that we feel menaced. Such intellectual contributions as these suggest the need for a correction to de Gaulle's remark, in his memoirs, about the American will to power, cloaking itself in idealism. By now, this will to power is not so much cloaked in idealism as it is drowned in fatuity. And academic intellectuals have made their unique contribution to this sorry picture. Let us, however, return to the war in Vietnam and the response that it has aroused among American intellectuals. A striking feature of the recent debate on Southeast Asian policy has been the distinction that is commonly drawn between responsible criticism, on the one hand, and sentimental, or emotional, or hysterical criticism, on the other. There is much to be learned from a careful study of the terms in which this distinction is drawn. The hysterical critics are to be identified, apparently, by their irrational refusal to accept one fundamental political axiom, namely that the United States has the right to extend its power and control without limit, insofar as is feasible. Responsible criticism does not challenge this assumption, but argues, rather, that we probably can't get away with it at this particular time and place. A distinction of this sort seems to be what Irving Kristol, for example, has in mind in his analysis of the protest over Vietnam policy, Encounter, August 1965. He contrasts the responsible critics, such as Walter Lippmann, The Times, and Senator Fulbright, with the Teach-In movement. Unlike the university protesters, he points out, Mr. Lippmann engages in no presumptuous suppositions as to what the Vietnamese people really want. He obviously doesn't much care or in legalistic exegesis as to whether, or to what extent, there is aggression or revolution in South Vietnam. His is a realpolitik point of view, and he will apparently even contemplate the possibility of a nuclear war against China in extreme circumstances. This is commendable, and contrasts favorably, for Crystal, with the talk of the unreasonable, ideological types in the teach-in movement, who often seem to be motivated by such absurdities as simple, virtuous anti-imperialism, who deliver harangues on the power structure, and who even sometimes stoop so low as to read articles and reports from the foreign press on the American presence in Vietnam. Furthermore, these nasty types are often psychologists, mathematicians, chemists, or philosophers, just as, incidentally, those most vocal in protest in the Soviet Union are generally physicists, literary intellectuals, and others remote from the exercise of power, rather than people with Washington contacts, who, of course, realized that had they a new, good idea about Vietnam, they would get a prompt and respectful hearing in Washington. The will to power is not so much cloaked in idealism as it is drowned in fatuity. And academic intellectuals have made their unique contribution to this sorry picture. I am not interested here in whether Crystal's characterization of protest and dissent is accurate, but rather in the assumptions on which it rests. Is the purity of American motives a matter that is beyond discussion, or that is irrelevant to discussion? Should decisions be left to experts with Washington contacts even if we assume that they command the necessary knowledge and principles to make the best decision, will they invariably do so? And, a logically prior question, is expertise applicable, that is there a body of theory and of relevant information, not in the public domain, that can be applied to the analysis of foreign policy or that demonstrates the correctness of present actions in some way that psychologists, mathematicians, chemists, and philosophers are incapable of comprehending? Although Crystal does not examine these questions directly, his attitude presupposes answers which are wrong in all cases. American aggressiveness, however it may be masked in pious rhetoric, is a dominant force in world affairs and must be analyzed in terms of its causes and motives. There is no body of theory or significant body of relevant information, beyond the comprehension of the layman, which makes policy immune from criticism. To the extent that expert knowledge is applied to world affairs, it is surely appropriate for a person of any integrity, quite necessary to question its quality and the goals it serves. These facts seem too obvious to require extended discussion. A corrective to Crystal's curious belief in the administration's openness to new thinking about Vietnam is provided by McGeorge Bundy in a recent issue of Foreign Affairs, January 1967. As Bundy correctly observes, on the main stage, the argument on Vietnam turns on tactics, not fundamentals, although, he adds, there are wild men in the wings. On stage center are, of course, the President, who in his recent trip to Asia had just magisterially reaffirmed our interest in the progress of the people across the Pacific, and his advisors, who deserve the understanding support of those who want restraint. It is these men who deserve the credit for the fact that the bombing of the North has been the most accurate and the most restrained in modern warfare, a solicitude which will be appreciated by the inhabitants, or former inhabitants, of Nam Dinh and Phu Ly and Vinh. It is these men, too, who deserve the credit for what was reported by Malcolm Brown as long ago as May 1965. In the South, huge sectors of the nation have been declared free bombing zones, in which anything that moves is a legitimate target. Tens of thousands of tons of bombs, rockets, napalm, and cannon fire are poured into these vast areas each week. If only by the laws of chance, bloodshed is believed to be heavy in these raids. Fortunately for the developing countries, Bundy assures us, American democracy has no taste for imperialism, and taken as a whole, the stock of American experience, understanding, sympathy, and simple knowledge is now much the most impressive in the world. It is true that 4/5 of all the foreign investing in the world is now done by Americans, and that the most admired plans and policies are no better than their demonstrable relation to the American interest, just as it is true, so we read in the same issue of Foreign Affairs, that the plans for armed action against Cuba were put into motion a few weeks after Mikoyan visited Havana, invading what had so long been an almost exclusively American sphere of influence. Unfortunately, such facts as these are often taken by unsophisticated Asian intellectuals as indicating a taste for imperialism. For example, a number of Indians have expressed their near exasperation at the fact that we have done everything we can to attract foreign capital for fertilizer plants, but the American and the other Western private companies know we are over a barrel, so they demand stringent terms which we just cannot meet. Christian Science Monitor, November 26, while Washington doggedly insists that deals be made in the private sector with private enterprise, IBID, December 5, 16. But this reaction, no doubt, simply reveals, once again, how the Asian mind fails to comprehend the diffuse and complex concepts of Western thought. It may be useful to study carefully the new, good ideas about Vietnam that are receiving a prompt and respectful hearing in Washington these days. The U.S. government printing office is an endless source of insight into the moral and intellectual level of this expert advice. In its publications one can read, for example, the testimony of Professor David N. Rowe, Director of Graduate Studies in International Relations at Yale University, before the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, see Note 11. Professor Rowe proposes, p. 266, that the United States buy all surplus Canadian and Australian wheat, so that there will be mass starvation in China. These are his words. Mind you, I am not talking about this as a weapon against the Chinese people. It will be. But that is only incidental. The weapon will be a weapon against the government because the internal stability of that country cannot be sustained by an unfriendly government in the face of general starvation. Professor Rowe will have none of the sentimental moralism that might lead one to compare this suggestion with, say, the Ostpolitik of Hitler's Germany. 17. Nor does he fear the impact of such policies on other Asian nations, for example, Japan. He assures us, from his very long acquaintance with Japanese questions, that the Japanese above all are people who respect power and determination. Hence they will not be so much alarmed by American policy in Vietnam that takes off from a position of power and intends to seek a solution based upon the imposition of our power upon local people that we are in opposition to. What would disturb the Japanese is a policy of indecision, a policy of refusal to face up to the problems in China and Vietnam and to meet our responsibilities there in a positive way, such as the way just cited. A conviction that we were unwilling to use the power that they know we have might alarm the Japanese people very intensely and shake the degree of their friendly relations with us. In fact, a full use of American power would be particularly reassuring to the Japanese, because they have had a demonstration of the tremendous power in action of the United States. Because they have felt our power directly. This is surely a prime example of the healthy, realpolitik point of view that Irving Kristol so much admires. But, one may ask, why restrict ourselves to such indirect means as mass starvation? Why not bombing? No doubt this message is implicit in the remarks to the same committee of the Reverend R.J. de Jaagher, Regent of the Institute of Far Eastern Studies, Seton Hall University, who explains that like all people who have lived under communism, the North Vietnamese would be perfectly happy to be bombed to be free, p. 345. Of course, there must be those who support the communists. But this is really a matter of small concern, as the Honorable Walter Robertson, Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs from 1953 to 1959, points out in his testimony before the same committee. He assures us that the Peeping regime represents something less than 3% of the population, p. 402. It may be that as honest men the students and junior faculty are attempting to find out the truth for themselves rather than ceding the responsibility to experts or to government. Consider, then, how fortunate the Chinese communist leaders are, compared to the leaders of the Viet Cong, who, according to Arthur Goldberg, New York Times, February 6, 1966, represent about 0.5% of the population of South Vietnam, that is, about 1/2 the number of new Southern recruits for the Viet Cong during 1965, if we can credit Pentagon statistics. 18. In the face of such experts as these, the scientists and philosophers of whom Crystal speaks would clearly do well to continue to draw their circles in the sand. Having settled the issue of the political irrelevance of the protest movement, Crystal turns to the question of what motivates it more generally, what has made students and junior faculty go left, as he sees it, amid general prosperity and under liberal, welfare state administrations. This, he notes, is a riddle to which no sociologist has as yet come up with an answer. Since these young people are well off, have good futures, etc., their protest must be irrational. It must be the result of boredom, of too much security, or something of this sort. Other possibilities come to mind. It may be, for example, that as honest men the students and junior faculty are attempting to find out the truth for themselves rather than ceding the responsibility to experts or to government, and it may be that they react with indignation to what they discover. These possibilities Crystal does not reject. They are simply unthinkable, unworthy of consideration. More accurately, these possibilities are inexpressible, the categories in which they are formulated, honesty, indignation, simply do not exist for the tough-minded social scientist. In this implicit disparagement of traditional intellectual values, Crystal reflects attitudes that are fairly widespread in academic circles. I do not doubt that these attitudes are in part a consequence of the desperate attempt of the social and behavioral sciences to imitate the surface features of sciences that really have significant intellectual content. But they have other sources as well. Anyone can be a moral individual, concerned with human rights and problems, but only a college professor, a trained expert, can solve technical problems by sophisticated methods. Ergo, it is only problems of the latter sort that are important or real. Responsible, non-ideological experts will give advice on tactical questions. Irresponsible, ideological types will harangue about principle and trouble themselves over moral issues and human rights, or over the traditional problems of man and society, concerning which social and behavioral science has nothing to offer beyond trivialities. Obviously, these emotional, ideological types are irrational, since, being well off and having power in their grasp, they shouldn't worry about such matters. At times the pseudo-scientific posing reaches levels that are almost pathological. Consider the phenomenon of Hermann Cohn, for example. Cohn has been both denounced as immoral and lauded for his courage. By people who should know better, his On Thermonuclear War has been described without qualification as one of the great works of our time. Stuart Hughes. The fact of the matter is that this is surely one of the emptiest works of our time, as can be seen by applying to it the intellectual standards of any existing discipline, by tracing some of its well-documented conclusions to the objective studies from which they derive, and by following the line of argument, where detectable. Cohn proposes no theories, no explanations, no factual assumptions that can be tested against their consequences, as do the sciences he is attempting to mimic. He simply suggests a terminology and provides a facade of rationality. When particular policy conclusions are drawn, they are supported only by ex cathedra remarks for which no support is even suggested. Example: the civil defense line probably should be drawn somewhere below $5 billion annually to keep from provoking the Russians. Why not $50 billion, or $5.00? What is more, Cohn is quite aware of this vacuity. In his more judicious moments he claims only that there is no reason to believe that relatively sophisticated models are more likely to be misleading than the simpler models and analogies frequently used as an aid to judgment. For those whose humor tends towards the macabre, it is easy to play the game of strategic thinking à la Cohn, and to prove what one wishes. For example, one of Cohn's basic assumptions is that an all-out surprise attack in which all resources are devoted to counter-value targets would be so irrational that, barring an incredible lack of sophistication or actual insanity among Soviet decision-makers, such an attack is highly unlikely. A simple argument proves the opposite. Premise 1: American decision-makers think along the lines outlined by Hermann Cohn. Premise 2: Cohn thinks it would be better for everyone to be red than for everyone to be dead. Premise 3, if the Americans were to respond to an all-out counter-value attack, then everyone would be dead. Conclusion, the Americans will not respond to an all-out counter-value attack, and therefore it should be launched without delay. Of course, one can carry the argument a step further. Fact, the Russians have not carried out an all-out counter-value attack. It follows that they are not rational. If they are not rational, there is no point in strategic thinking. Therefore, of course this is all nonsense, but nonsense that differs from Kant's only in the respect that the argument is of slightly greater complexity than anything to be discovered in his work. What is remarkable is that serious people actually pay attention to these absurdities, no doubt because of the facade of tough-mindedness and pseudoscience. It is a curious and depressing fact that the anti-war movement falls prey all too often to similar confusions. In the fall of 1965, for example, there was an international conference on alternative perspectives on Vietnam, which circulated a pamphlet to potential participants stating its assumptions. The plan was to set up study groups in which 3 types of intellectual tradition will be represented: 1. Area specialists, 2. Social theory, with special emphasis on theories of the international system, of social change and development, of conflict and conflict resolution, or of revolution; 3. The analysis of public policy in terms of basic human values, rooted in various theological, philosophical, and humanist traditions. The second intellectual tradition will provide general propositions, derived from social theory and tested against historical, comparative, or experimental data. The third will provide the framework out of which fundamental value questions can be raised and in terms of which the moral implications of societal actions can be analyzed. The hope was that by approaching the questions of Vietnam policy from the moral perspectives of all great religions and philosophical systems, we may find solutions that are more consistent with fundamental human values than current American policy in Vietnam has turned out to be. In short, the experts on values, i.e., spokesmen for the great religions and philosophical systems, will provide fundamental insights on moral perspectives, and the experts on social theory will provide general empirically validated propositions and general models of conflict. From this interplay, new policies will emerge, presumably from application of the canons of scientific method. The only debatable issue, it seems to me, is whether it is more ridiculous to turn to experts in social theory for general well-confirmed propositions, or to the specialists in the great religions and philosophical systems for insights into fundamental human values. There is much more that can be said about this topic, but, without continuing, I would simply like to emphasize that, as is no doubt obvious, the cult of the experts is both self-serving, for those who propound it, and fraudulent. Obviously, one must learn from social and behavioral science whatever one can. Obviously, these fields should be pursued as seriously as possible. But it will be quite unfortunate, and highly dangerous, if they are not accepted and judged on their merits and according to their actual, not pretended, accomplishments. In particular, if there is a body of theory, well tested and verified, that applies to the conduct of foreign affairs or the resolution of domestic or international conflict, its existence has been kept a well-guarded secret. In the case of Vietnam, if those who feel themselves to be experts have access to principles or information that would justify what the American government is doing in that unfortunate country, they have been singularly ineffective in making this fact known. To anyone who has any familiarity with the social and behavioral sciences, or the policy sciences, the claim that there are certain considerations and principles too deep for the outsider to comprehend is simply an absurdity, unworthy of comment. When we consider the responsibility of intellectuals, our basic concern must be their role in the creation and analysis of ideology. When we consider the responsibility of intellectuals, our basic concern must be their role in the creation and analysis of ideology. And, in fact, Crystal's contrast between the unreasonable ideological types and the responsible experts is formulated in terms that immediately bring to mind Daniel Bell's interesting and influential The End of Ideology, an essay which is as important for what it leaves unsaid as for its actual content. Point 19. Bell presents and discusses the Marxist analysis of ideology as a mask for class interest, quoting Marx's well-known description of the belief of the bourgeoisie that the special conditions of its emancipation are the general conditions through which alone modern society can be saved and the class struggle avoided. He then argues that the age of ideology is ended, supplanted, at least in the West, by a general agreement that each issue must be settled in its own terms, within the framework of a welfare state in which, presumably, experts in the conduct of public affairs will have a prominent role. Bell is quite careful, however, to characterize the precise sense of ideology in which ideologies are exhausted. He is referring to ideology only as the conversion of ideas into social levers, to ideology as a set of beliefs, infused with passion, which seeks to transform the whole of a way of life. The crucial words are transform and convert into social levers. Intellectuals in the West, he argues, have lost interest in converting ideas into social levers for the radical transformation of society. Now that we have achieved the pluralistic society of the welfare state, they see no further need for a radical transformation of society. We may tinker with our way of life here and there, but it would be wrong to try to modify it in any significant way. With this consensus of intellectuals, ideology is dead. There are several striking facts about Bell's essay. First, he does not point out the extent to which this consensus of the intellectuals is self-serving. He does not relate his observation that, by and large, intellectuals have lost interest in transforming the whole of a way of life to the fact that they play an increasingly prominent role in running the welfare state. He does not relate their general satisfaction with the welfare state to the fact that, as he observes elsewhere, America has become an affluent society, offering place and prestige to the one-time radicals. Secondly, he offers no serious argument to show that intellectuals are somehow right or objectively justified in reaching the consensus to which he alludes, with its rejection of the notion that society should be transformed. Indeed, although Bell is fairly sharp about the empty rhetoric of the New Left, he seems to have a quite utopian faith that technical experts will be able to cope with the few problems that still remain, for example, the fact that labor is treated as a commodity, and the problems of alienation. It seems fairly obvious that the classical problems are very much with us. One might plausibly argue that they have even been enhanced in severity and scale. For example, the classical paradox of poverty in the midst of plenty is now an ever-increasing problem on an international scale. Whereas one might conceive, at least in principle, of a solution within national boundaries, a sensible idea of transforming international society to cope with vast and perhaps increasing human misery is hardly likely to develop within the framework of the intellectual consensus that Bell describes. Thus it would seem natural to describe the consensus of Bell's intellectuals in somewhat different terms from his. Using the terminology of the first part of his essay, we might say that the welfare state technician finds justification for his special and prominent social status in his science, specifically, in the claim that social science can support a technology of social tinkering on a domestic or international scale. He then takes a further step, ascribing in a familiar way a universal validity to what is in fact a class interest. He argues that the special conditions on which his claim to power and authority are based are, in fact, the only general conditions by which modern society can be saved, that social tinkering within a welfare state framework must replace the commitment to the total ideologies of the past, ideologies which were concerned with the transformation of society. Having found his position of power, having achieved security and affluence, he has no further need for ideologies that look to radical change. The scholar-expert replaces the free-floating intellectual who felt that the wrong values were being honored, and rejected the society, and who has now lost his political role, now, that is, that the right values are being honored. Conceivably, it is correct that the technical experts who will, or hope to, manage the industrial society will be able to cope with the classical problems without a radical transformation of society. It is conceivably true that the bourgeoisie was right in regarding the special conditions of its emancipation as the only general conditions by which modern society would be saved. In either case, an argument is in order, and skepticism is justified when none appears. Within the same framework of general utopianism, Bell goes on to pose the issue between welfare state scholar experts and third world ideologists in a rather curious way. He points out, quite correctly, that there is no issue of communism, the content of that doctrine having been long forgotten by friends and foes alike. Rather, he says, the question is an older one, whether new societies can grow by building democratic institutions and allowing people to make choices and sacrifices voluntarily, or whether the new elites, heady with power, will impose totalitarian means to transform their societies. The question is an interesting one. It is odd, however, to see it referred to as an older one. Surely he cannot be suggesting that the West chose the democratic way, for example, that in England during the Industrial Revolution, the farmers voluntarily made the choice of leaving the land, giving up cottage industry, becoming an industrial proletariat, and voluntarily decided, within the framework of the existing democratic institutions, to make the sacrifices that are graphically described in the classic literature on 19th-century industrial society. One may debate the question whether authoritarian control is necessary to permit capital accumulation in the underdeveloped world, but the Western model of development is hardly one that we can point to with any pride. It is perhaps not surprising to find Walt Rostow referring to the more humane processes of industrialization that Western values would suggest, an American policy in Asia. Those who have a serious concern for the problems that face backward countries, and for the role that advanced industrial societies might, in principle, play in development and modernization, must use somewhat more care in interpreting the significance of the Western experience. Returning to the quite appropriate question, whether new societies can grow by building democratic institutions or only by totalitarian means, I think that honesty requires us to recognize that this question must be directed more to American intellectuals than to third world ideologists. The backward countries have incredible, perhaps insurmountable problems, and few available options. The United States has a wide range of options, and has the economic and technological resources, though, evidently, neither the intellectual nor moral resources, to confront at least some of these problems. It is easy for an American intellectual to deliver homilies on the virtues of freedom and liberty, but if he is really concerned about, say, Chinese totalitarianism or the burdens imposed on the Chinese peasantry in forced industrialization, then he should face a task that is infinitely more important and challenging: the task of creating, in the United States, the intellectual and moral climate, as well as the social and economic conditions, that would permit this country to participate in modernization and development in a way commensurate with its material wealth and technical capacity. Large capital gifts to Cuba and China might not succeed in alleviating the authoritarianism and terror that tend to accompany early stages of capital accumulation, but they are far more likely to have this effect than lectures on democratic values. It is possible that even without capitalist encirclement in its various manifestations, the truly democratic elements in revolutionary movements, in some instances, Soviets and collectives, might be undermined by an elite of bureaucrats and technical intelligentsia. But it is almost certain that capitalist encirclement itself, which all revolutionary movements now have to face, will guarantee this result. The lesson, for those who are concerned to strengthen the democratic, spontaneous, and popular elements in developing societies, is quite clear. Lectures on the two-party system, or even on the really substantial democratic values that have been in part realized in Western society, are a monstrous irrelevance, given the effort required to raise the level of culture in Western society to the point where it can provide a social lever for both economic development and the development of true democratic institutions in the Third World and, for that matter, at home. Large gifts to Cuba and China might not succeed in alleviating the authoritarianism, but they are far more likely to help than lectures on democratic values. A good case can be made for the conclusion that there is indeed something of a consensus among intellectuals who have already achieved power and affluence, or who sense that they can achieve them by accepting society as it is and promoting the values that are being honored in this society. It is also true that this consensus is most noticeable among the scholar experts who are replacing the free-floating intellectuals of the past. In the university, these scholar experts construct a value-free technology for the solution of technical problems that arise in contemporary society. Taking a responsible stance towards these problems, in the sense noted earlier. This consensus among the responsible scholar experts is the domestic analog to that proposed, internationally, by those who justify the application of American power in Asia, whatever the human cost, on the grounds that it is necessary to contain the expansion of China, an expansion which is, to be sure, hypothetical for the time being. 21 That is, to translate from State Department newspeak, on the grounds that it is essential to reverse the Asian nationalist revolutions or, at least, to prevent them from spreading. The analogy becomes clear when we look carefully at the ways in which this proposal is formulated. With his usual lucidity, Churchill outlined the general position in a remark to his colleague of the moment, Joseph Stalin, at Tehran in 1943. The government of the world must be entrusted to satisfied nations, who wished nothing more for themselves than what they had. If the world government were in the hands of hungry nations, there would always be danger. But none of us had any reason to seek for anything more. Our power placed us above the rest. We were like the rich men dwelling at peace within their habitations. For a translation of Churchill's biblical rhetoric into the jargon of contemporary social science, one may turn to the testimony of Charles Wolfe, senior economist of the Rand Corporation, at the Congressional Committee hearings cited earlier. I am dubious that China's fears of encirclement are going to be abated, eased, relaxed in the long-term future. But I would hope that what we do in Southeast Asia would help to develop within the Chinese body politic more of a realism and willingness to live with this fear than to indulge it by support for liberation movements, which admittedly depend on a great deal more than external support. The operational question for American foreign policy is not whether that fear can be eliminated or substantially alleviated, but whether China can be faced with a structure of incentives, of penalties and rewards, of inducements that will make it willing to live with this fear. The point is further clarified by Thomas Schelling: there is growing experience, which the Chinese can profit from, that although the United States may be interested in encircling them, may be interested in defending nearby areas from them, it is, nevertheless, prepared to behave peaceably if they are. In short, we are prepared to live peaceably in our, to be sure, rather extensive habitations. And, quite naturally, we are offended by the undignified noises from the servants' quarters. If, let us say, a peasant-based revolutionary movement tries to achieve independence from foreign powers and the domestic structures they support, or if the Chinese irrationally refuse to respond properly to the schedule of reinforcement that we have prepared for them, if they object to being encircled by the benign and peace-loving rich men who control the territories on their borders as a natural right, then, evidently, we must respond to this belligerence with appropriate force. It is this mentality that explains the frankness with which the U.S. government and its academic apologists defend the American refusal to permit a political settlement in Vietnam at a local level, a settlement based on the actual distribution of political forces. Even government experts freely admit that the NLF is the only truly mass-based political party in South Vietnam. 22. That the NLF had made a conscious and massive effort to extend political participation, even if it was manipulated, on the local level so as to involve the people in a self-contained, self-supporting revolution, p. 374, and that this effort had been so successful that no political groups, with the possible exception of the Buddhists, thought themselves equal in size and power. To risk entering into a coalition, fearing that if they did the whale would swallow the minnow, p. 362. Moreover, they concede that until the introduction of overwhelming American force, the NLF had insisted that the struggle should be fought out at the political level and that the use of massed military might was in itself illegitimate. The battleground was to be the minds and loyalties of the rural Vietnamese, the weapons were to be ideas, pages 91 to 92, Cf. also pages 93, 99 to 100, and 8, 155f, and, correspondingly, that until mid-1964, aid from Hanoi was largely confined to two areas: doctrinal know-how and leadership personnel, p. 321. Captured NLF documents contrast the enemy's military superiority with their own political superiority, p. 106, thus fully confirming the analysis of American military spokesmen who define our problem as how, with considerable armed force but little political power, to contain an adversary who has enormous political force but only modest military power. 23. Similarly, the most striking outcome of both the Honolulu Conference in February and the Manila Conference in October was the frank admission by high officials of the Saigon government that they could not survive a peaceful settlement that left the Viet Cong political structure in place even if the Viet Cong guerrilla units were disbanded, that they are not able to compete politically with the Vietnamese Communists. Charles Moore, New York Times, February 11, 1966, italics mine. Thus, Moore continues, the Vietnamese demand a pacification program which will have as its core the destruction of the clandestine Viet Cong political structure and the creation of an iron-like system of government political control over the population. And from Manila, the same correspondent, on October 23, quotes a high South Vietnamese official as saying that, frankly, we are not strong enough now to compete with the communists on a purely political basis. They are organized and disciplined. The non-communist nationalists are not. We do not have any large, well-organized political parties and we do not yet have unity. We cannot leave the Viet Cong in existence. Officials in Washington understand the situation very well. Thus Secretary Rusk has pointed out that if the Viet Cong come to the conference table as full partners they will, in a sense, have been victorious in the very aims that South Vietnam and the United States are pledged to prevent. January 28, 1966. Max Frankel reported from Washington in the Times on February 18, 1966, that compromise has had no appeal here because the administration concluded long ago that the non-communist forces of South Vietnam could not long survive in a Saigon coalition with communists. It is for that reason and not because of an excessively rigid sense of protocol that Washington has steadfastly refused to deal with the Viet Cong or recognize them as an independent political force. In short, we will magnanimously permit Viet Cong representatives to attend negotiations only if they will agree to identify themselves as agents of a foreign power and thus forfeit the right to participate in a coalition government, a right which they have now been demanding for a half-dozen years. We well know that in any representative coalition, our chosen delegates could not last a day without the support of American arms. Therefore, we must increase American force and resist meaningful negotiations, until the day when a client government can exert both military and political control over its own population, a day which may never dawn, for as William Bundy has pointed out, we could never be sure of the security of a Southeast Asia from which the Western presence was effectively withdrawn. Thus if we were to negotiate in the direction of solutions that are put under the label of neutralization, this would amount to capitulation to the Communists. 24 According to this reasoning, then, South Vietnam must remain, permanently, an American military base. All of this is, of course, reasonable, so long as we accept the fundamental political axiom that the United States, with its traditional concern for the rights of the weak and downtrodden, and with its unique insight into the proper mode of development for backward countries, must have the courage and the persistence to impose its will by force until such time as other nations are prepared to accept these truths or simply to abandon hope. If it is the responsibility of the intellectual to insist upon the truth, it is also his duty to see events in their historical perspective. Thus one must applaud the insistence of the Secretary of State on the importance of historical analogies, the Munich analogy, for example. As Munich showed, a powerful and aggressive nation with a fanatic belief in its manifest destiny will regard each victory, each extension of its power and authority, as a prelude to the next step. The matter was very well put by Adlai Stevenson, when he spoke of the old route whereby expansive powers push at more and more doors, believing they will open until, at the ultimate door, resistance is unavoidable and major war breaks out. Herein lies the danger of appeasement, as the Chinese tirelessly point out to the Soviet Union which, they claim, is playing Chamberlain to our Hitler in Vietnam. Of course, the aggressiveness of liberal imperialism is not that of Nazi Germany, though the distinction may seem academic to a Vietnamese peasant who is being gassed or incinerated. We do not want to occupy Asia, we merely wish, to return to Mr. Wolf, to help the Asian countries progress toward economic modernization, as relatively open and stable societies, to which our access, as a country and as individual citizens, is free and comfortable. The formulation is appropriate. Recent history shows that it makes little difference to us what form of government a country has so long as it remains an open society, in our peculiar sense of this term, that is, a society that remains open to American economic penetration or political control. If it is necessary to approach genocide in Vietnam to achieve this objective, then this is the price we must pay in defense of freedom and the rights of man. If it is the responsibility of the intellectual to insist upon the truth, it is also his duty to see events in their historical perspective. In pursuing the aim of helping other countries to progress towards open societies, with no thought of territorial aggrandizement, we are breaking no new ground. In the congressional hearings that I cited earlier, Hans Morgenthau aptly describes our traditional policy towards China as one which favors what you might call freedom of competition with regard to the exploitation of China, OPCIT, p. 128. In fact, few imperialist powers have had explicit territorial ambitions. Thus in 1784, the British Parliament announced, to pursue schemes of conquest and extension of dominion in India are measures repugnant to the wish, honor, and policy of this nation. Shortly after this, the conquest of India was in full swing. A century later, Britain announced its intentions in Egypt under the slogan intervention, reform, withdrawal. It is obvious which parts of this promise were fulfilled within the next half-century. In 1936, on the eve of hostilities in North China, the Japanese stated their basic principles of national policy. These included the use of moderate and peaceful means to extend her strength, to promote social and economic development, to eradicate the menace of communism, to correct the aggressive policies of the great powers, and to secure her position as the stabilizing power in East Asia. Even in 1937, the Japanese government had no territorial designs upon China. In short, we follow a well-trodden path. It is useful to remember, incidentally, that the United States was apparently quite willing, as late as 1939, to negotiate a commercial treaty with Japan and arrive at a modus vivendi if Japan would change her attitude and practice towards our rights and interests in China, as Secretary Hull put it. The bombing of Chongqing and the rape of Nanking were unpleasant, it is true, but what was really important was our rights and interests in China, as the responsible, unhysterical men of the day saw quite clearly. It was the closing of the open door by Japan that led inevitably to the Pacific War, just as it is the closing of the open door by Communist China itself that may very well lead to the next, and no doubt last, Pacific War. Quite often, the statements of sincere and devoted technical experts give surprising insight into the intellectual attitudes that lie in the background of the latest savagery. Consider, for example, the following comment by the economist Richard Lindholm, in 1959, expressing his frustration over the failure of economic development in Free Vietnam. The use of American aid is determined by how the Vietnamese use their incomes and their savings. The fact that a large portion of the Vietnamese imports financed with American aid are either consumer goods or raw materials used rather directly to meet consumer demands is an indication that the Vietnamese people desire these goods, for they have shown their desire by their willingness to use their piastres to purchase them. 25. In short, the Vietnamese people desire Buicks and air conditioners, rather than sugar refining equipment or road building machinery, as they have shown by their behavior in a free market. And however much we may deplore their free choice, we must allow the people to have their way. Of course, There are also those two-legged beasts of burden that one stumbles on in the countryside, but as any graduate student of political science can explain, they are not part of a responsible modernizing elite, and therefore have only a superficial biological resemblance to the human race. In no small measure, it is attitudes like this that lie behind the butchery in Vietnam, and we had better face up to them with candor, or we will find our government leading us towards a final solution in Vietnam, and in the many Vietnams that inevitably lie ahead. Let me finally return to Dwight MacDonald and the responsibility of intellectuals. MacDonald quotes an interview with a death camp paymaster who burst into tears when told that the Russians would hang him. Why should they? What have I done? He asked. MacDonald concludes, only those who are willing to resist authority themselves when it conflicts too intolerably with their personal moral code, only they have the right to condemn the death camp paymaster. The question "what have I done?" is one that we may well ask ourselves, as we read each day of fresh atrocities in Vietnam as we create, or mouth, or tolerate the deceptions that will be used to justify the next defense of freedom. Part 2. The responsibility of intellectuals, Redux, using privilege to challenge the state. Since we often cannot see what is happening before our eyes, it is perhaps not too surprising that what is at a slight distance removed is utterly invisible. We have just witnessed an instructive example, President Obama's dispatch of 79 commandos into Pakistan on May 1 to carry out what was evidently a planned assassination of the prime suspect in the terrorist atrocities of 9/11, Osama bin Laden. Though the target of the operation, unarmed and with no protection, could easily have been apprehended, he was simply murdered, his body dumped at sea without autopsy. The action was deemed just and necessary in the liberal press. There will be no trial, as there was in the case of Nazi criminals, a fact not overlooked by legal authorities abroad who approve of the operation but object to the procedure. As Elaine Scarry reminds us, the prohibition of assassination in international law traces back to a forceful denunciation of the practice by Abraham Lincoln, who condemned the call for assassination as international outlawry in 1863, an outrage, which civilized nations view with horror and merits the sternest retaliation. In 1967, writing about the deceit and distortion surrounding the American invasion of Vietnam, I discussed the responsibility of intellectuals, borrowing the phrase from an important essay of Dwight MacDonald's after World War II. With the 10th anniversary of 9/11 arriving, and widespread approval in the United States of the assassination of the chief suspect, it seems a fitting time to revisit that issue. But before thinking about the responsibility of intellectuals, it is worth clarifying to whom we are referring. The concept of intellectuals in the modern sense gained prominence with the 1898 Manifesto of the Intellectuals produced by the Dreyfusards, who, inspired by Émile Zola's open letter of protest to France's president, condemned both the framing of French artillery officer Alfred Dreyfus on charges of treason and the subsequent military cover-up. The Dreyfusard stance conveys the image of intellectuals as defenders of justice, confronting power with courage and integrity. But they were hardly seen that way at the time. A minority of the educated classes, the Dreyfusards were bitterly condemned in the mainstream of intellectual life, in particular by prominent figures among the immortals of the strongly anti-Dreyfusard Académie Française. Stephen Lukes writes. To the novelist, politician, and anti-Dreyfusard leader Maurice Barrès, Dreyfusards were anarchists of the lecture platform. To another of these immortals, Ferdinand Brunetière, the very word intellectual ignified one of the most ridiculous eccentricities of our time. I mean the pretension of raising writers, scientists, professors, and philologists to the rank of supermen, who dare to treat our generals as idiots, our social institutions as absurd, and our traditions as unhealthy. Who then were the intellectuals? The minority inspired by Zola, who was sentenced to jail for libel, and fled the country? Or the immortals of the Academy? The question resonates through the ages, in one or another form, and today offers a framework for determining the responsibility of intellectuals. The phrase is ambiguous, does it refer to intellectuals' moral responsibility as decent human beings in a position to use their privilege and status to advance the causes of freedom, justice, mercy, peace, and other such sentimental concerns? Or does it refer to the role they are expected to play, serving, not derogating, leadership and established institutions? One answer came during World War I, when prominent intellectuals on all sides lined up enthusiastically in support of their own states. In their manifesto of 93 German intellectuals, leading figures in one of the world's most enlightened states called on the West to have faith in us. Believe that we shall carry on this war to the end as a civilized nation, to whom the legacy of a Goethe, a Beethoven, and a Kant, is just as sacred as its own hearths and homes. Their counterparts on the other side of the intellectual trenches matched them in enthusiasm for the noble cause, but went beyond in self-adulation. In the new republic they proclaimed, the effective and decisive work on behalf of the war has been accomplished by a class which must be comprehensively but loosely described as the intellectuals. These progressives believed they were ensuring that the United States entered the war under the influence of a moral verdict reached, after the utmost deliberation by the more thoughtful members of the community. They were, in fact, the victims of concoctions of the British Ministry of Information, which secretly sought to direct the thought of most of the world, but particularly the thought of American progressive intellectuals who might help to whip a pacifist country into war fever. John Dewey was impressed by the great psychological and educational lesson of the war, which proved that human beings, more precisely, the intelligent men of the community, can take hold of human affairs and manage them deliberately and intelligently to achieve the ends sought, admirable by definition. Not everyone towed the line so obediently, of course. Notable figures such as Bertrand Russell, Eugene Debs, Rosa Luxemburg, and Karl Liebknecht were, like Zola, sentenced to prison. Debs was punished with particular severity, a 10-year prison term for raising questions about President Wilson's war for democracy and human rights. Wilson refused him amnesty after the war ended, though Harding finally relented. Some, such as Thorstein Veblen, were chastised but treated less harshly. Veblen was fired from his position in the Food Administration after preparing a report showing that the shortage of farm labor could be overcome by ending Wilson's brutal persecution of labor, specifically the international workers of the world. Randolph Bourne was dropped by the progressive journals after criticizing the League of Benevolently Imperialistic Nations and their exalted endeavors. The pattern of praise and punishment is a familiar one throughout history. Those who line up in the service of the state are typically praised by the general intellectual community, and those who refuse to line up in service of the state are punished. Thus, in retrospect, Wilson and the progressive intellectuals who offered him their services are greatly honored, but not Debs. Luxemburg and Liebknecht were murdered and have hardly been heroes of the intellectual mainstream. Russell continued to be bitterly condemned until after his death, and in current biographies still is. Since power tends to prevail, intellectuals who serve their governments are considered the responsible ones. In the 1970s, prominent scholars distinguished the two categories of intellectuals more explicitly. A 1975 study, The Crisis of Democracy, labeled Brunetiere's ridiculous eccentrics value-oriented intellectuals who pose a challenge to democratic government which is, potentially at least, as serious as those posed in the past by aristocratic cliques, fascist movements, and communist parties. Among other misdeeds, these dangerous creatures devote themselves to the derogation of leadership, the challenging of authority, and they challenge the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. Some even sink to the depths of questioning the nobility of war aims, as Bourne had. This castigation of the miscreants who question authority and the established order was delivered by the scholars of the Liberal Internationalist Trilateral Commission. The Carter administration was largely drawn from their ranks. Like the New Republic progressives during World War I, the authors of The Crisis of Democracy extend the concept of the intellectual beyond Brunetiere's ridiculous eccentrics to include the better sort as well, the technocratic and policy-oriented intellectuals, responsible and serious thinkers who devote themselves to the constructive work of shaping policy within established institutions and to ensuring that indoctrination of the young proceeds on course. It took Dewey only a few years to shift from the responsible technocratic and policy-oriented intellectual of World War I to an anarchist of the lecture platform, as he denounced the unfree press and questioned how far genuine intellectual freedom and social responsibility are possible on any large scale under the existing economic regime. What particularly troubled the trilateral scholars was the excess of democracy during the time of troubles, the 1960s, when normally passive and apathetic parts of the population entered the political arena to advance their concerns: minorities, women, the young, the old, working people. In short, the population, sometimes called the special interests. They are to be distinguished from those whom Adam Smith called the masters of mankind, who are the principal architects of government policy and pursue their vile maxim, all for ourselves and nothing for other people. The role of the masters in the political arena is not deplored, or discussed, in the trilateral volume, presumably because the masters represent the national interest, like those who applauded themselves for leading the country to war after the utmost deliberation by the more thoughtful members of the community had reached its moral verdict. To overcome the excessive burden imposed on the state by the special interests, the trilateralists called for more moderation in democracy, a return to passivity on the part of the less deserving, perhaps even a return to the happy days when Truman had been able to govern the country with the cooperation of a relatively small number of Wall Street lawyers and bankers, and democracy therefore flourished. The trilateralists could well have claimed to be adhering to the original intent of the Constitution, intrinsically an aristocratic document designed to check the democratic tendencies of the period by delivering power to a better sort of people and barring those who were not rich, well-born, or prominent from exercising political power, in the accurate words of the historian Gordon Wood. In Madison's defense, however, we should recognize that his mentality was pre-capitalist. In determining that power should be in the hands of the wealth of the nation, the more capable set of men, he envisioned those men on the model of the enlightened statesman and benevolent philosopher of the imagined Roman world. They would be pure and noble, men of intelligence, patriotism, property, and independent circumstances whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. So endowed, these men would refine and enlarge the public views, guarding the public interest against the mischiefs of democratic majorities. In a similar vein, the progressive Wilsonian intellectuals might have taken comfort in the discoveries of the behavioral sciences, explained in 1939 by the psychologist and education theorist Edward Thorndike. It is the great good fortune of mankind that there is a substantial correlation between intelligence and morality, including goodwill toward one's fellows. Consequently, our superiors in ability are on the average our benefactors, and it is often safer to trust our interests to them than to ourselves. A comforting doctrine, though some might feel that Adam Smith had the sharper eye. Since power tends to prevail, intellectuals who serve their governments are considered responsible, and value-oriented intellectuals are dismissed or denigrated. At home, that is. With regard to enemies, the distinction between the two categories of intellectuals is retained, but with values reversed. In the old Soviet Union, the value-oriented intellectuals were the honored dissidents, while we had only contempt for the apparatchiks and commissars, the technocratic and policy-oriented intellectuals. Similarly, in Iran we honor the courageous dissidents and condemn those who defend the clerical establishment. And elsewhere generally. The honorable term dissident is used selectively. It does not, of course, apply, with its favorable connotations, to value-oriented intellectuals at home or to those who combat U.S. supported tyranny abroad. Take the interesting case of Nelson Mandela, who was removed from the official terrorist list in 2008, and can now travel to the United States without special authorization. 20 years earlier, he was the criminal leader of one of the world's more notorious terrorist groups, according to a Pentagon report. That is why President Reagan had to support the apartheid regime, increasing trade with South Africa in violation of congressional sanctions and supporting South Africa's depredations in neighboring countries, which led, according to a UN study, to 1.5 million deaths. That was only one episode in the war on terrorism that Reagan declared to combat the plague of the modern age, or, as Secretary of State George Shultz had it, a return to barbarism in the modern age. We may add hundreds of thousands of corpses in Central America and tens of thousands more in the Middle East, among other achievements. Small wonder that the great communicator is worshipped by Hoover Institution scholars as a colossus whose spirit seems to stride the country, watching us like a warm and friendly ghost, recently honored further by a statue that defaces the American Embassy in London. What particularly troubled the trilateral scholars was the excess of democracy in the 1960s. The Latin American case is revealing. Those who called for freedom and justice in Latin America are not admitted to the pantheon of honored dissidents. For example, a week after the fall of the Berlin Wall, 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, all Jesuit priests, had their heads blown off on the direct orders of the Salvadoran High Command. The perpetrators were from an elite battalion armed and trained by Washington that had already left a gruesome trail of blood and terror, and had just returned from renewed training at the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The murdered priests are not commemorated as honored dissidents, nor are others like them throughout the hemisphere. Honored dissidents are those who called for freedom in enemy domains in Eastern Europe, who certainly suffered, but not remotely like their counterparts in Latin America. The distinction is worth examination, and tells us a lot about the two senses of the phrase responsibility of intellectuals, and about ourselves. It is not seriously in question, as John Coatsworth writes in the recently published Cambridge University History of the Cold War, that from 1960 to the Soviet collapse in 1990, the numbers of political prisoners, torture victims, and executions of nonviolent political dissenters in Latin America vastly exceeded those in the Soviet Union and its East European satellites. Among the executed were many religious martyrs, and there were mass slaughters as well, consistently supported or initiated by Washington. Why then the distinction? It might be argued that what happened in Eastern Europe is far more momentous than the fate of the South at our hands. It would be interesting to see the argument spelled out. And also to see the argument explaining why we should disregard elementary moral principles, among them that if we are serious about suffering and atrocities, about justice and rights, we will focus our efforts on where we can do the most good typically, where we share responsibility for what is being done. We have no difficulty demanding that our enemies follow such principles. Few of us care, or should, what Andrei Sakharov or Shirin Ebadi say about US or Israeli crimes. We admire them for what they say and do about those of their own states, and the conclusion holds far more strongly for those who live in more free and democratic societies, and therefore have far greater opportunities to act effectively. It is of some interest that in the most respected circles, practice is virtually the opposite of what elementary moral values dictate. But let us conform and keep only to the matter of historical import. The U.S. wars in Latin America from 1960 to 1990, quite apart from their horrors, have long-term historical significance. To consider just one important aspect, in no small measure they were wars against the Church, undertaken to crush a terrible heresy proclaimed at Vatican II in 1962, which, under the leadership of Pope John XXIII, ushered in a new era in the history of the Catholic Church, in the words of the distinguished theologian Hans Kung, restoring the teachings of the Gospels that had been put to rest in the 4th century when the Emperor Constantine established Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire, instituting a revolution that converted the persecuted church to a persecuting church. The heresy of Vatican II was taken up by Latin American bishops who adopted the preferential option for the poor. Priests, nuns, and laypersons then brought the radical pacifist message of the Gospels to the poor, helping them organize to ameliorate their bitter fate in the domains of U.S. power. That same year, 1962, President Kennedy made several critical decisions. One was to shift the mission of the militaries of Latin America from hemispheric defense, an anachronism from World War II, to internal security, in effect, war against the domestic population, if they raise their heads. Charles Meekling, who led U.S. counterinsurgency and internal defense planning from 1961 to 1966, describes the unsurprising consequences of the 1962 decision as a shift from toleration of the rapacity and cruelty of the Latin American military to direct complicity in their crimes to U.S. support for the methods of Heinrich Himmler's extermination squads. One major initiative was a military coup in Brazil, planned in Washington and implemented shortly after Kennedy's assassination, instituting a murderous and brutal national security state. The plague of repression then spread through the hemisphere, including the 1973 coup installing the Pinochet dictatorship, and later the most vicious of all, the Argentine dictatorship, Reagan's favorite. Central America's turn not for the first time came in the 1980s under the leadership of the warm and friendly ghost who is now revered for his achievements. The murder of the Jesuit intellectuals as the Berlin Wall fell was a final blow in defeating the heresy, culminating a decade of horror in El Salvador that opened with the assassination, by much the same hands, of Archbishop Oscar Romero, the voice for the voiceless. The victors in the war against the Church declare their responsibility with pride. The School of the Americas, since renamed, famous for its training of Latin American killers, announces as one of its talking points that the liberation theology that was initiated at Vatican II was defeated with the assistance of the U.S. Army. Actually, the November 1989 assassinations were almost a final blow. More was needed. A year later Haiti had its first free election, and to the surprise and shock of Washington, which like others had anticipated the easy victory of its own candidate from the privileged elite, the organized public in the slums and hills elected Jean-Bertrand Aristide, a popular priest committed to liberation theology. The United States at once moved to undermine the elected government and, after the military coup that overthrew it a few months later, lent substantial support to the vicious military junta and its elite supporters. Trade was increased in violation of international sanctions and increased further under Clinton, who also authorized the Texaco Oil Company to supply the murderous rulers, in defiance of his own directives. I will skip the disgraceful aftermath, amply reviewed elsewhere, except to point out that in 2004, the two traditional torturers of Haiti, France and the United States, joined by Canada, forcefully intervened, kidnapped President Aristide, who had been elected again, and shipped him off to Central Africa. He and his party were effectively barred from the farcical 2010-11 elections, the most recent episode in a horrendous history that goes back hundreds of years and is barely known among the perpetrators of the crimes, who prefer tales of dedicated efforts to save the suffering people from their grim fate. Another fateful Kennedy decision in 1962 was to send a Special Forces mission to Colombia, led by General William Yarborough, who advised the Colombian security forces to undertake paramilitary, sabotage and/or terrorist activities against known communist proponents, activities that should be backed by the United States. The meaning of the phrase communist proponents was spelled out by the respected president of the Colombian Permanent Committee for Human Rights, former Minister of Foreign Affairs Alfredo Vázquez Carrizosa, who wrote that the Kennedy administration took great pains to transform our regular armies into counterinsurgency brigades, accepting the new strategy of the death squads, ushering in what is known in Latin America as the national security doctrine. Not defense against an external enemy, but a way to make the military establishment the masters of the game. With the right to combat the internal enemy, as set forth in the Brazilian doctrine, the Argentine doctrine, the Uruguayan doctrine, and the Colombian doctrine, it is the right to fight and to exterminate social workers, trade unionists, men and women who are not supportive of the establishment, and who are assumed to be communist extremists. And this could mean anyone, including human rights activists such as myself. If we are serious about justice, we will focus our efforts where we share responsibility for what is being done. In a 1980 study, Lars Skultz, the leading U.S. academic specialist on human rights in Latin America, found that U.S. aid has tended to flow disproportionately to Latin American governments which torture their citizens. To the hemisphere's relatively egregious violators of fundamental human rights. That included military aid, was independent of need, and continued through the Carter years. Ever since the Reagan administration, it has been superfluous to carry out such a study. In the 1980s, one of the most notorious violators was El Salvador, which accordingly became the leading recipient of U.S. military aid, to be replaced by Colombia when it took the lead as the worst violator of human rights in the hemisphere. Vázquez Carrizosa himself was living under heavy guard in his Bogotá residence when I visited him there in 2001 as part of a mission of Amnesty International, which was opening its year-long campaign to protect human rights defenders in Colombia because of the country's horrifying record of attacks against human rights and labor activists, and mostly the usual victims of state terror, the poor and defenseless. Terror and torture in Colombia were supplemented by chemical warfare, fumigation, under the pretext of the war on drugs, leading to huge flight to urban slums and misery for the survivors. Colombia's Attorney General's office now estimates that more than 140,000 people have been killed by paramilitaries, often acting in close collaboration with the U.S.-funded military. Signs of the slaughter are everywhere. On a nearly impassable dirt road to a remote village in southern Colombia a year ago, my companions and I passed a small clearing with many simple crosses marking the graves of victims of a paramilitary attack on a local bus. Reports of the killings are graphic enough. Spending a little time with the survivors, who are among the kindest and most compassionate people I have ever had the privilege of meeting, makes the picture more vivid, and only more painful. This is the briefest sketch of terrible crimes for which Americans bear substantial culpability, and that we could easily ameliorate, at the very least. But it is more gratifying to bask in praise for courageously protesting the abuses of official enemies, a fine activity, but not the priority of a value-oriented intellectual who takes the responsibilities of that stand seriously. The victims within our domains, unlike those in enemy states, are not merely ignored and quickly forgotten, but are also cynically insulted. One striking illustration came a few weeks after the murder of the Latin American intellectuals in El Salvador. Václav Havel visited Washington and addressed a joint session of Congress. Before his enraptured audience, Havel lauded the defenders of freedom in Washington who understood the responsibility that flowed from being the most powerful nation on earth, crucially, their responsibility for the brutal assassination of his Salvadoran counterparts shortly before. The liberal intellectual class was enthralled by his presentation. Havel reminds us that we live in a romantic age, Anthony Lewis gushed. Other prominent liberal commentators reveled in Havel's idealism, his irony, his humanity, as he preached a difficult doctrine of individual responsibility while Congress obviously ached with respect for his genius and integrity, and asked why America lacks intellectuals so profound, who elevate morality over self-interest in this way, praising us for the tortured and mutilated corpses that litter the countries that we have left in misery. We need not tarry on what the reaction would have been had Father Elicuria, the most prominent of the murdered Jesuit intellectuals, spoken such words at the Duma after elite forces armed and trained by the Soviet Union assassinated Havel and half a dozen of his associates, a performance that is inconceivable. The assassination of Ben Laden, too, directs our attention to our insulted victims. There is much more to say about the operation, including Washington's willingness to face a serious risk of major war and even leakage of fissile materials to jihadis, as I have discussed elsewhere, but let us keep to the choice of name, Operation Geronimo. The name caused outrage in Mexico and was protested by indigenous groups in the United States, but there seems to have been no further notice of the fact that Obama was identifying bin Laden with the Apache Indian chief. Geronimo led the courageous resistance to invaders who sought to consign his people to the fate of that hapless race of Native Americans, which we are exterminating with such merciless and perfidious cruelty, among the heinous sins of this nation, for which I believe God will one day bring it to judgment, in the words of the grand strategist John Quincy Adams, the intellectual architect of manifest destiny, uttered long after his own contributions to these sins. The casual choice of the name is reminiscent of the ease with which we name our murder weapons after victims of our crimes: Apache, Black Hawk, Cheyenne. We might react differently if the Luftwaffe were to call its fighter planes Jew and Gypsy. The first 9/11, unlike the second, did not change the world. It was nothing of very great consequence, Kissinger said. Denial of these heinous sins is sometimes explicit. To mention a few recent cases, 2 years ago in one of the world's leading left-liberal intellectual journals, the New York Review of Books, Russell Baker outlined what he learned from the work of the heroic historian Edmund Morgan, namely, that when Columbus and the early explorers arrived they found a continental vastness sparsely populated by farming and hunting people. In the limitless and unspoiled world stretching from tropical jungle to the frozen north, there may have been scarcely more than 1 million inhabitants. The calculation is off by many tens of millions, and the vastness included advanced civilizations throughout the continent. No reactions appeared, though 4 months later the editors issued a correction, noting that in North America there may have been as many as 18 million people and, unmentioned, tens of millions more from tropical jungle to the frozen north. This was all well known decades ago, including the advanced civilizations and the merciless and perfidious cruelty of the extermination, but not important enough even for a casual phrase. In the London Review of Books a year later, the noted historian Mark Mazur mentioned American mistreatment of the Native Americans, again eliciting no comment. Would we accept the word mistreatment for comparable crimes committed by enemies? If the responsibility of intellectuals refers to their moral responsibility as decent human beings in a position to use their privilege and status to advance the cause of freedom, justice, mercy, and peace, and to speak out not simply about the abuses of our enemies but, far more significantly, about the crimes in which we are implicated and can ameliorate or terminate if we choose, how should we think of 9/11? The notion that 9/11 changed the world is widely held, understandably. The events of that day certainly had major consequences, domestic and international. One was to lead President Bush to redeclare Ronald Reagan's war on terrorism. The first one has been effectively disappeared, to borrow the phrase of our favorite Latin American killers and torturers, presumably because the consequences do not fit well with preferred self-images. Another consequence was the invasion of Afghanistan, then Iraq, and more recently military interventions in several other countries in the region and regular threats of an attack on Iran. All options are open, in the standard phrase. The costs, in every dimension, have been enormous. That suggests a rather obvious question, not asked for the first time: was there an alternative? A number of analysts have observed that bin Laden won major successes in his war against the United States. He repeatedly asserted that the only way to drive the US from the Muslim world and defeat its satraps was by drawing Americans into a series of small but expensive wars that would ultimately bankrupt them, the journalist Eric Margolis writes. The United States, first under George W. Bush and then Barack Obama, rushed right into bin Laden's trap. Grotesquely overblown military outlays and debt addiction. Maybe the most pernicious legacy of the man who thought he could defeat the United States. A report from the Costs of War project at Brown University's Watson Institute for International Studies estimates that the final bill will be $3.2, $4 trillion. Quite an impressive achievement by bin Laden. That Washington was intent on rushing into bin Laden's trap was evident at once. Michael Scheuer, the senior CIA analyst responsible for tracking bin Laden from 1996 to 1999, writes, "Bin Laden has been precise in telling America the reasons he is waging war on us. The Al-Qaeda leader," Scheuer continues, "is out to drastically alter US and Western policies toward the Islamic world. And, as Scheuer explains, bin Laden largely succeeded. U.S. forces and policies are completing the radicalization of the Islamic world, something Osama bin Laden has been trying to do with substantial but incomplete success since the early 1990s. As a result, I think it is fair to conclude that the United States of America remains bin Laden's only indispensable ally. And arguably remains so, even after his death. There is good reason to believe that the jihadi movement could have been split and undermined after the 9/11 attack, which was criticized harshly within the movement. Furthermore, the crime against humanity, as it was rightly called, could have been approached as a crime, with an international operation to apprehend the likely suspects. That was recognized in the immediate aftermath of the attack, but no such idea was even considered by decision-makers in government. It seems no thought was given to the Taliban's tentative offer. How serious an offer, we cannot know, to present the Al-Qaeda leaders for a judicial proceeding. At the time, I quoted Robert Fisk's conclusion that the horrendous crime of 9/11 was committed with wickedness and awesome cruelty and accurate judgment. The crimes could have been even worse. Suppose that Flight 93, downed by courageous passengers in Pennsylvania, had bombed the White House, killing the president. Suppose that the perpetrators of the crime planned to, and did, impose a military dictatorship that killed thousands and tortured tens of thousands. Suppose the new dictatorship established, with the support of the criminals, an international terror center that helped impose similar torture and terror states elsewhere, and, as icing on the cake, brought in a team of economists, call them the Kandahar Boys, who quickly drove the economy into one of the worst depressions in its history. That, plainly, would have been a lot worse than 9/11. As we all should know, this is not a thought experiment. It happened. I am, of course, referring to what in Latin America is often called the first 9/11, September 11, 1973, when the United States succeeded in its intensive efforts to overthrow the democratic government of Salvador Allende in Chile with a military coup that placed General Pinochet's ghastly regime in office. The dictatorship then installed the Chicago Boys, economists trained at the University of Chicago to reshape Chile's economy. Consider the economic destruction, the torture and kidnappings, and multiply the numbers killed by 25 to yield per capita equivalents, and you will see just how much more devastating the first 9/11 was. The goal of the overthrow, in the words of the Nixon administration, was to kill the virus that might encourage all those foreigners who are out to screw us by trying to take over their own resources, and more generally to pursue a policy of independent development along lines disliked by Washington. In the background was the conclusion of Nixon's National Security Council that if the United States could not control Latin America, it could not expect to achieve a successful order elsewhere in the world. Washington's credibility would be undermined, as Henry Kissinger put it. The first 9/11, unlike the second, did not change the world. It was nothing of very great consequence, Kissinger assured his boss a few days later. And judging by how it figures in conventional history, his words can hardly be faulted, though the survivors may see the matter differently. These events of little consequence were not limited to the military coup that destroyed Chilean democracy and set in motion the horror story that followed. As already discussed, the first 9/11 was just one act in the drama that began in 1962 when Kennedy shifted the mission of the Latin American militaries to internal security. The shattering aftermath is also of little consequence, the familiar pattern when history is guarded by responsible intellectuals. Privilege yields opportunity, and opportunity confers responsibilities. It seems to be close to a historical universal that conformist intellectuals, the ones who support official aims and ignore or rationalize official crimes, are honored and privileged in their own societies, and the value-oriented punished in one or another way. The pattern goes back to the earliest records. It was the man accused of corrupting the youth of Athens who drank the hemlock, much as Dreyfusards were accused of corrupting souls, and, in due course, society as a whole, and the value-oriented intellectuals of the 1960s were charged with interference with indoctrination of the young. In the Hebrew scriptures there are figures who by contemporary standards are dissident intellectuals, called prophets in the English translation. They bitterly angered the establishment with their critical geopolitical analysis, their condemnation of the crimes of the powerful, their calls for justice and concern for the poor and suffering. King Ahab, the most evil of the kings, denounced the prophet Elijah as a hater of Israel, the first self-hating Jew, or anti-American in the modern counterparts. The prophets were treated harshly, unlike the flatterers at the court, who were later condemned as false prophets. The pattern is understandable. It would be surprising if it were otherwise. As for the responsibility of intellectuals, there does not seem to me to be much to say beyond some simple truths. Intellectuals are typically privileged, merely an observation about usage of the term. Privilege yields opportunity, and opportunity confers responsibilities. An individual then has choices.